of all, I think your analysis was very straight line. History doesn't run in a straight line.
Kid, you cannot tell your neighbor he is stealing ducks when you are stealing funds.
As High Commissioner, I was wrong. As Charandas Prasad, I reacted naturally how any person would have.
I did not come here for that kind of abuse. I did not come here for that kind of abuse. If you're going to go down that road, I'll walk off.
But it's all okay once they're talking. If they were talking, I could not have been here today.
You got ADHD. I got nothing.
Calm down.
I think I've done enough in terms of taking our team out of trouble from losing.
Come on, Lou Taylor. That's good. I'm reading the script now, and the first person that comes to my mind to play a detective,
yes,
but an erratic detective, Michael Rodriguez.
Why an African slap an Indian? Why a man and slap a woman? Look, how you deal with that? You deal with that.
We must encourage platforms like this because it brings together different people and allows for discussions to take place in our country on a multiplicity of fundamental issues.
Gildarie, you apologizing for something you think I did is wrong. I don't want you to do that, and you should not have done that. Hi there. Welcome to the Freddie Kissoon Show with co-host Gildarie and Akash Prasad. Thanks for being with us this evening. Our guest is a young person with lots of experience, and we like to take a journey with her through her experience. It's always priceless to get the views of the people who are the present generation in Guyana and will be around for a long time. And when you're young with that kind of interesting experience, the hour just flies. Our guest is someone that I'm very fond of. She picketed for me in the sun and gave her energy when my contract was terminated in 2011 at University of Guyana. She was a student then. And since then, she's had wide experience in things that should interest you. Our guest this evening is young Sara Bharrat. She entered mainstream of Guyanese life as a journalist, went on to social activism, and then with the International Republican Institute as the local program manager, in which she specialized in governance. So it should be an interesting 1 hour, so we wouldn't get much into distraction, but to say good evening to my co-host, Akash Prasad. So, without further delay, the protocol. Sara, thanks for picketing for me and protesting for me 12 years ago or 14 years ago.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for the opportunity to be here.
It's a pleasure.
It's good to meet you today, Akash.
Wonderful. I think it's going to lead for a wonderful conversation indeed, because I believe that the young people like yourself and me, I'm still young, we are the movers and thinkers of this country. And our opinion, and once we put the facts on the table, then I see no reason why people shouldn't gravitate to this sort of thinking as we move, as this country move forward, and the trajectory that this country is on is absolutely a fantastic one. So again, it's a pleasure of mine too.
Absolutely. And you've been generous in describing me as a youth. I think I'm a senior citizen youth at this point.
Senior citizen youth, okay.
Yes.
We will compartmentalize for the interview Sara's life. Journalism part 1, then movement from journalism to civil society activism, and then entry into International Republican Institute, and 4 years plus of organizing the process of governance and the education of governance in Guyana. So that's going to be our methodology. So we start with her personal life, and I'll hand over to Akash.
Yeah, Sarah, when I read a piece on you yesterday, something really struck me. It was that little 10-year or 11-year-old girl planting bora in the hot sun. You said from morning till noon sometimes to make the ends meet. A lot of time people don't understand that these things really do impact your life. How has that impacted you, Sarah?
You know, I consider that to be some of the most important moments in my education as a young Guyanese. When people see me today, what they see often is, you know, a somewhat polished young person. You know, I'm in a jacket a lot, and they don't expect that at heart who I am is a country girl. I'm a country girl from a middle-class Indian family, from a Hindu family, and that comes with a particular set of values. Mm-hmm. You know, I grew up largely in a single-parent home from around the age of 6.5 to 7. That's when my parents would have split, and so I was in a single-parent home, and my mother went to live with a brother of hers, so I then went into this extended family setting, and, you know, to ensure that I had books to go to school. At that time, just before Common Entrance, we now call that the grade 6 assessment, you had to get the junior English, the first aid, and books, you know, were very expensive then. And the only way to get it was to work equally hard. And, you know, I think it's easy to look back at moments like that and be like, oh, I grew up hard, I punished. Mm-hmm. But for me, that was character building. It was an opportunity to ensure that I would be able to acquire a certain set of values as a young person. And what it taught me was not just courage, not just humility, but the importance of consistent hard work and not making excuses.
Where are you from?
So I'm from a small village on the east bank of Demerara called Craig Village.
I know Craig. Right?
So Craig is just, you exit Diamond Grove and then Craig. It's a mixed community. And traditionally, you know, a lot of the families in our community are farmers and small shop owners, very humble people. Of course, since I was a child in the 90s, early 2000s, things have shifted, right? We've had a lot of families migrate. We've had a lot of Hispanic dwellers come to rent, and so the flavor of the village has changed somewhat. But in my time, in my childhood, you know, it was very much a farming community. We've grown sugarcane, rice, cash crops. We've reared poultry. We've grown, you know, cows. My family had cows at a certain point. So at heart, if you asked what my first profession was in this country, I was a farmer.
Sarah, just before Akash come in, your parents are still alive?
Absolutely. Both of my parents are alive.
Could you ask your parents after the show, just give them a call and ask them if they know about an incident in Craig? Mm-hmm. They would have been young. But if they know about it when they were young, or they heard about it from their parents, which would be your grandparents, about Prime Minister Forbes Burnham. Mm-hmm. His car ran off the road at Craig. No. And that particular car is in a museum. As soon as you enter the museum, you see the car. So Craig is famous for the car of the Prime Minister Forbes Burnham.
Oh, wow. What a thing to be famous for.
Could you ask them if they've ever heard about that, or if they know about it when they were growing up? But Akash has a question.
Before we get into it, Grandma, you seem to love that lady. Tell me about your nanny.
So, you know, for those of us not familiar, Guyanese Creole English is influenced by the languages that all of our foreparents brought here. And the East Indian languages particularly have remained in the East Indian community in Guyana, primarily in our kinship terms of address, right? Indeed. So for me, my nanny is my mother's mother. So when I say nanny, I'm signaling not just grandmother, but maternal grandmother. Right. So, you know, when my mother became a single parent, at that point in my life, she depended on the support of our extended family. And where we stayed at first, we were in Craig Sideline Dam. It's no longer a dam. It's a beautiful paved road now. But when I was in primary school, it was a mud dam. So when it rained, you know, you had to trudge through this mud, and you go to a neighbor's yard or a relative's yard close to school or close to the public road to wash your feet off and then finish getting ready to head into classes. And when I wrote Common Entrance, the grade 6 assessment, I got St. Stanislaus College. I had an offer to go to President's College. But, Indian families, it took us a while to warm up to sending our children to those stay-in schools. And I don't think we like to do it still. We don't like boarding school culture. So my grandmother was like, okay, my house is closer to the public road. You don't have to deal with walking through those conditions to get to school. Come and stay with me. And that really started, I think, a deeper bond between us. Prior to that, she had been very integral in teaching me about my roots and our religious traditions and all of that. But I think when I went to live with her full time at 11 to go to St. Stanislaus, that is where our bond really bloomed, because she never questioned what I wanted to do in life. Whatever I went home and I said my academic interest was, my professional interest was, she supported it immediately. Wow. She never questioned whether it was viable financially. My first degree is in English. And when you tell people that you're reading for your first degree in English, they're like, what are you going to do with that? You're going to teach? And I'm like, what's wrong with teaching? It's a noble profession. But actually, no, I'm going to do something much greater than teach. And this is what I want to do. And she never questioned it. And I believe part of that came from the fact that, she had to leave school very early. She left I think, at the equivalent of primary 4. And she was very brilliant. She got married very young on a Christmas day at maybe 13 or 14. So all of this intelligence in her and all of this potential, she never had an opportunity to realize it. And what both she as well as my mother did, and the women in my family and extended community, they ensured that women in my family, in our generation, that we had the opportunity to go on to get tertiary education. In fact, my generation in my family, like many other Guyanese out there, I am the first generation to acquire this level of education and to go on to become a professional. And that's only possible because of the sacrifices my nanny made and my mother, and because they were not afraid to be courageous for me while I was still learning how to be courageous for myself.
Wow. Let's stick with the personal, because when we get into your years with the International Republican Institute, and then I'm going to tell our viewers how I got to know you in journalism. Let's stick a little bit with the personal. Your husband is a chef.
Absolutely.
Tell us about this man who cooks. He has to cook something for
So he features very strongly in both my personal and professional stories. But on the personal end of things, I met him at the University of Guyana in 2011. We both started our programs then, and he was reading for an associate's in history. So we walk into this historical methodologies classroom one day sometime in September, and I'm looking at this person with this big, as we say in Guyanese, this lawless laugh. And this huge, tall man.
It doesn't strike me as that. I met him
I'm
twice.
like, what is going on? Well, we grow up and we get refined. And I'm like...
Yeah, when we were talking on the seawall last Thursday, he was looking down.
So that's how I noticed him. And he then noticed me because I was the know-it-all in class. I've always been very curious about learning. And so for me, a part of learning is asking questions, getting into discussions. And that's how we came about each other. I was like, okay, you're loud. I'm a know-it-all. And over time, we became friends. But in 2012, he left to go to culinary school in Orlando, Florida. And he would spend, I think, the next 7 or so years outside of Guyana, really completing his education and adding to his professional experience. And one of the greatest accomplishments for me personally, it's that I was able to convince him to move back to Guyana. I've stayed in Guyana, and that was an important choice to me. I wanted to demonstrate as a young Guyanese that it's possible for us to not just be born here and raised here, but to be educated here primarily. And for that education
That's
to
a patriot
work,
for you, Akash.
right?
That's right, exactly.
And so I've always tried to encourage other young people to, go abroad, get your education, get experience under your belt, but come back home and help us to develop Guyana. And so when I was was able to show him the value of this particular moment in Guyana's development. And like, come back home, start a business. You have some experience on the belt running a business. He had started up Masala Express in St. Kitts, and he agreed and he came back home. He started Sushi Express and Experiences. We operated as a cloud kitchen to begin with, and just last September we were able to get one of the stalls out on the seawall in that newly beautified area. And business has been going quite well. For a startup, I must say I am encouraged at the rate of growth, because you expect startups to be operating at a loss, at least for the first few years. And I can tell you that this startup has done well, breaking even or even, achieving a certain amount of gain consistently over that period of time.
Well, I'd like to repeat that your husband has a sushi restaurant opposite the bandstand at the newly refurbished ambience of the First Lady. You want to tell us where it's located, what's the name, and then we're going to move on.
Oh, absolutely. So Sushi Express and Experiences, like Mr. Kissoon just said, it's located obliquely opposite the bandstand at the Georgetown Seawall. If you're driving up the Pegasus Road, it's the first upstairs and downstairs building on your right-hand side. You can't miss us. We're painted in a salmon kind of peachy color, and there is our logo outside. And we're open on Thursdays at 6 p.m. through Sundays at 6 p.m. We're there until 10, and you can find our menu on Instagram or Facebook at Sushi Express. So reach out to us. We're always happy to teach you more about this, because what we're trying to do is to diversify the culinary culture in the country.
All right, so I first met you when you worked as a journalist in the Starbuck News, and I was with the Catholic Standard as a columnist, and we worked in the Lindo Creek Massacre. I will leave Akash to ask you about your journalistic experience.
Absolutely.
When I read your story, you spoke about the pressures of the newsroom, and it molded and shaped you in many ways. Is there one, perhaps it's this issue with the Lindo Creek, but is there one event that really stands out where the pressures were on you to deliver something that would have helped to mold you to become who you are?
I wouldn't be the Guyanese that I am today without being in the newsroom for 4+ years. And how I landed up in the newsroom, it's actually, I think it was just a bit of fate happening there. I was in the process of having a residence visa processed for the US, and I was looking at opportunities for partial scholarships in the US as well. And I had nothing to do that August holiday, and my grandmother saw this ad in the newspaper. Starbuck News had an ad for reporters, and she's like, well, why don't you apply for that and do something for the few months instead of just being at home doing nothing? And so I applied for this. I went to the Starbuck News. I walked into the newsroom. I knew nothing about media. I knew nothing about the news culture. I'd barely been out of my house, apart from to go to school at that point. And I walked in and they said, well, you need to write an essay as part of your competency test. And I wrote the essay, and in the process of writing that, I'm like, wow, I really don't know much about Guyana, and that ought not to be. And I saw that as an opportunity to really delve in and learn about the country. So I got the job. And, at that time, where we've brought our work culture in this country, our interpersonal relationships in this country, we weren't quite as polished and nice back then. So it was a usual thing. And the newsroom is a high-pressured environment. You know this, Mr. Kissoon. You know this as well, Mr. Prasad. It's a very, very high-pressured environment. And so I'm 18, and people are shouting at each other. You're working until press time, some shifts. And not only was I working until press time, you start off in the courts. You go to the court, the magistrate's court, every day of the work week, and you cover the sitting there. And that's sort of like boot camp as a new reporter. And then once you've graduated from covering the courts, they then figure out which particular area in the newsroom you might be better suited for. And for me, unfortunately, I was suited to the areas of crime. The crime reporter went on leave just around then. I filled in for her, and I I just had a knack for covering those types of stories, but I also had a knack for analysis and presenting analysis. So I would go on to cover other stories in the rice industry, for example, and a few other economic issues. And I've done investigative cultural pieces and so forth. But largely, a lot of my work in those early years focused on reporting on crime. And, at this particular time in the country, we're talking about 2008 to 2011. So there are the unrests, they're the pelting of those homemade devices at the High Court. We are grappling with the effects.
The aftermath of the Buxton things.
Right. We're dealing with the post effects of the 2005 flood. We're dealing with minor flooding issues now. Well, say minor relative to the 2005 flood. It's not as big, but it's still a huge problem for the East Coast communities. And then we're also dealing with the massacres. And this is where Mr. Kissoon and I met. The first, this is the Fine Man saga. So this is Lindo Creek. We're talking about the Bartica massacre, the Lusignan massacre. We're talking about the murder of Jiffy Lubes. We're talking about huge drug busts at the airport. I believe at the bottom end of my time in the newsroom, there was the pink suitcase bust. So those are the types of issues I am grappling with at 18, now going into my early 20s. I'm also traveling the length and breadth of Region 4, and I'm having opportunities to travel to other regions and to see Guyanese people, to see their issues and hear about it. But for a while, I still have trouble sleeping sometimes, to be honest. It never really leaves you. And I think mental health is something we really need to pay more attention to for media workers in this country, particularly if you're working with these violent issues. And I did work with some very violent issues, and my colleagues, my senior colleagues in the media at the time, more so than me, they were on the front lines and they were seeing more than I saw. And it frightened me. But it also taught me that this couldn't be the future that I was going to pass on. Certainly not the future I wanted to head into as a young Guyanese, and certainly not the future I would want to pass along to any children I would possibly have. And so I asked myself, well, Sarah, we can't stay in the media indefinitely. Yes, it's a noble profession, it's an important profession, but what else can we do to contribute to the development of the country? But the media is perhaps think of it as an undergraduate degree. 4 years studying everything political and socioeconomic in this country across the length and breadth of this country. And I would encourage young Guyanese who have time free, whether it's, you're looking for a work study attachment, you're looking for an internship, reach out to media houses and use that as an opportunity to learn about the space in which you exist and you're growing and working.
Okay, if you know anyone that is being trained in journalism, we're offering you to talk to them, and they could come and sit in the interviews, and they could ask a few questions. We're willing to accommodate that. So that's an open invitation if you know anyone.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
They have a chair next there, and they can listen to the interview and they can ask 1 or 2 questions. Okay, well, let's move from journalism. You've gone from that, and then you had some activism in civil society before you move on to International Republican Institute. That's going to take a lot of time because that's a very important international organization in third world countries. So, civil society organization. I have a private email exchange with you which I cannot reveal at your request. But there is one thing in that email which I think I can bring up in a general way. And this is where our viewers should pay attention to. There was one thing you said in that email which I would like you to expand on theoretically. We're not going to look at names or anything. You said one of the things you found, much to your chagrin, in civil society activism, is that there are people who, the problem with people, some people, or the problem with civil society is that the need to be independent, to be real civil society, independent-minded people is lacking. You want to expand on that?
Yeah, let me talk a little bit more about that, but let me frame it first. So looking at me, you can tell a few things about the demographics I fall into. I fall into the youth demographic. I am obviously a woman, and my ethnicity, you know, I think you can classify me as East
ethnicity,
Indian.
gender,
Right.
and youth. Right.
Now, imagine the challenges and barriers for somebody like me engaging on issues generally. So it's not easy to get into rooms and spaces and to work on sensitive things particularly. Now, I've been engaged in civil society since my early to mid-20s, maybe 23, 24. So I've been doing this for upwards of 12 years, maybe almost 15 years now. I've been engaged in some way, shape, or form. Prior to the big change elections in 2015, I like to call that those elections that saw the change in government, the big change elections, because change was the metaphor that won those elections. Now, prior to the 2015 elections, you were seeing a particular type of activism in civil society, and I'm not going to name any organizations. We'll keep this at an academic analytical level, right? So you were seeing a particular type of spirited activism in civil society, whether it focused on transparency and accountability, whether it focused on other industries and other aspects of development. And what happened post 2015, and it shocked me, it's many civil society organizations began struggling with membership, right? Because the government changed and then there was a dwindling in membership for a couple of the organizations I was a member of at the time. And that shocked me. And it really impacted, I believe, in my personal view, it impacted the ability of civil society to operate in those years. And I'm not sure that civil society itself has fully recovered from that 2015 moment. And as I went on now, we fast forward through that particular administration. We've changed government again in 2020, and I'm not going to touch on that because I know we'll talk about that some more. But we changed government again in 2020, and by now I think civil society has, it's caught itself to a certain degree. The membership mobilization has gone on the uptick again. They're accessing resources. There's work being done. And here now, the barrier is a different type of barrier. We now see that there's a challenge with creating space for new, younger leadership. I've also observed a challenge with taking a more pragmatic, strategic approach to addressing issues. And the fact of the matter is, any single institution you talk about, those institutions are peopled by human beings who have a particular lived experience, human beings who have experienced particular types of trauma throughout their life, and they may have acquired the tools that they need, they may have the emotional intelligence that they require to largely operate in an objective way, but unfortunately that is just if we were to assume that the ideal is present, and the ideal is that civil society representatives across the board are able to put their biases aside and to operate in a fully nonpartisan way. We don't live in an ideal world, and so while you may find that there are some representatives who do match that ideal, there are others who really do struggle with the traumas they've experienced, and they really do struggle with separating their personal views from an independent view, from the view that is necessary to advance work on a particular issue. And when that happens, you find a gatekeeping of the space and a gatekeeping of the work that occurs on the issue. And quite frankly, the cost of that to the development of Guyana is too expensive, Mr. Kissoon. It's simply too expensive. When we work on particular issues, and at this moment, I think one of the most sensitive issues in the country, it has to do with elections and anything that falls in the realm of elections. So whether we're talking about electoral integrity, electoral reform, any group that works on those particular types of issues, including, addressing challenges we've had with race divisions in this country, then we have a responsibility to ensure that we're approaching that work with integrity. We have a responsibility to ensure that we are sound and capable of acting from a logical space to advance the issue, because if we do otherwise, the damage that we're doing on top of the existing damage is so expensive for the country, and it really sets us back in the solution that we're trying to achieve. It does.
Akash?
You have a blog, Sara Bharrat blog, and I read a letter, an open letter to then President David Granger and former President Barbara Jagdale, former President Barbara Jagdale, who was then opposition leader, and that letter really, and you were one of the signatories, many signatories in that letter. It really reached out to these two people to bring a country together. I want to read a paragraph, if you permit me.
Please.
And I quote, "Fortunately, we have seen many pictures of you both shaking hands, smiling, walking together, talking. We waited to see if it will take us towards a path we've longed for. So far, none of the friendly encounters have done so. We felt betrayed. Somehow your willingness to speak to each other has only divided this nation further. And worse than the division is the hopelessness it has stirred in the hearts of our people. So we ask, is this how you want history to remember you? As the brothers who continued a family feud spanning decades and ripping apart a nation on the verge of greatness." This was August 16, 2019. Sarah, what has changed? There isn't even no shaking of hands, if I may say. What has changed?
You know, unfortunately, not much has changed. But before I elaborate on that, let me first give a little bit of background on the blog for viewers who may not have come across it. I haven't been blogging consistently for quite a few years now. And the reason for that is I found myself in professions where I have a certain responsibility to represent the interests of the organizations I work with. And so I've not always felt like I was free to offer the type of political commentary you've seen on my blog before. And I sort of shifted away from that. Now, that's one part. The second part is, when I started blogging in 2013, that came from a very personal place. And it was a time in Guyana when we were just beginning to understand that, hey, there's something to this social media tool. Websites were still a big online tool. Blogging was now emerging. And I'm happy to say that now, 10 plus years later, we see the power of social media, whether or not we're using it responsibly. There have been lots of people now offering commentary, lots of bloggers. So it's great to see that. But when I started blogging, it was sparked by an incident that happened to me as a university student. So when my husband and I started dating, we were walking down Avenue of the Republic, and there's that stretch around, I think, America Street. There are photocopying shops that used to be there. There were always vendors out on the sidewalk, plying the trade, selling knickknacks. And we walking down minding our business, and when you go to Sushi Express, you'll see what my husband looks like. He is the definition of a mixed race Guyanese.
Well, I know what he looks like. You introduced me twice.
Right, so you know what he looks like, right? It's hard. It depends.
Last week I saw him.
It's difficult to peg him to a particular ethnic background, right?
He's mixed.
He's mixed. He's clearly mixed. Some days he'll look more Indian than anything else. Some days he'll look like what we in Guyana.
Mulatto.
Yes, like to call a half scallop putty, and it's really no telling. But this vendor felt comfortable enough to shout to us, to me, why you walking down the road with that black man? And I was so shocked, I didn't respond to it. But afterwards, it really sparked my thinking process. And I did a lot of introspection. And the more I thought about it, the more I started linking it back to the fact that race relations in this country was interconnected with our culture of politics and the way in which we conducted elections, for example. And I, at 20-something, 23, 24, I'm just out of the media. I'm grappling with dealing with all of those events that happened in the previous years. And now I'm face to face with this race thing for the first time. And I was angry. And I did not know what to do about it except write. And so that was the genesis of the blog. That is how I started that blog. And I hoped that by being courageous enough to share my personal story, to say, well, hey, I am a young Guyanese woman of Indian ancestry, and this has been my lived experience in this country with racism, with politics. I hoped it would encourage other people in my age group to be honest about their own experiences, to examine it. But unfortunately, what happened to me, and this happens to everyone at some point, and it continues to happen. What happened to me is that the content I was creating was beneficial to different groups with different interests. And so if what I was saying at the time could benefit somebody's rhetoric, they would pick my work up and they would run with it and use it to justify whatever positions they were taking to support their agenda. And after a while, that work lost the spirit of what it was meant to achieve, and it became a tool for, unfortunately, people with political interests and politicians and so forth. And that was the second reason why I sort of stepped back, and I didn't write for a while because I felt frustrated, disillusioned, and I just felt like I couldn't do it anymore. Now, you'll notice intermittent articles now, like the 2019 article you just cited, where there's an appeal. It's really a very emotive appeal to the two highest leaders in the land to find a way to work together. And as you've just said, we're still in a time where we're not even shaking hands. There's a challenge with civility. Now, the thing about cross-party collaboration and parliamentary civility, it's that we have not seen it. I think even members of parliament themselves, political leaders, I've heard them say this in open spaces. They are very aware of the breakdown in civility, the breakdown in the room for collaboration. For example, Minister of Governance and Parliamentary Affairs, Gildarie, she shared in a room full of members of parliament that participated in, I don't want to touch too much on it because it's an International Republican Institute element of my work, but she said in a room full of National Assembly members that, look, yes, we have struggled with civility, but she pointed to a time when civility and cross-party collaboration was indeed present, and particularly among women members of parliament. They've pushed important bills to counter domestic violence, for example, in this country, and collaboration and civility is possible. Right? And we need that more than ever. And where I would like to see us get, and where we absolutely have to get given the geopolitical space in which Guyana finds itself right now, is we have to ensure that we are approaching development from the standpoint of inclusivity. And so there needs to be national strategies for development that cross-cut the interests of political groups and other types of groups in this country. And those strategies, or maybe it's one overarching strategy, has to be owned by all of the parties in the National Assembly and their constituents, and it must guide development for Guyana over a particular period of time and be championed by the government of this country, regardless of which party is in government. And so that emotive appeal that you read there, that is where that's coming from. And we had hoped, and when I say we, myself and some of the young people I've spoken to and collaborated with, obviously written joint pieces with, we had hoped that by appealing to the feeling of leaders for Guyana, that perhaps that more than anything else would inspire them or motivate them or cause a little shift to approach things in a particular way. But I've come to learn that perhaps it's not productive appealing to feeling, because what we're dealing with is highly intelligent leaders, even though they might operate in a way that causes us to question it sometimes. Our leaders are highly intelligent people. And these highly intelligent folks, and I've done it time and time again myself, sometimes we decide that we're going to dismiss the emotive part of things because that's a liability. And what we're going to focus on is the tactic and the pragmatism of it and the logic of it. And so I believe that what we now have to do is to appeal to the good sense of our leaders, to their logic and you look at where Guyana is, and this is perhaps the biggest opportunity we have ever had in our history, in our relatively short history as an independent nation, to secure the future of this country for generations to come. And we simply cannot allow and if you look at it in terms of scalability, it becomes really not so significant, these national internal squabbles to cause us to lose that opportunity. What Guyana needs now more than ever is civility in parliament and cross-party collaboration to tackle development. How we get there, I'm sure we've all at this table, and many people who are listening to this have tried to answer that question. They've tried to implement solutions to try to get us there, but we haven't quite found a way yet. But I believe we're going to find it.
When you tell me whether you were a founding member or a foundation member, I was told the difference between a founding member is the person who actually was part of the birthing process.
Correct.
Like three of us sit down here and form an organization. And the foundation member is someone who came in at the foundational level. Now, were you a founding member of the election reform group, or you came in shortly after? And what drove you to that?
Right. Given the distinction you just made there, between a founding member versus a foundational member, the title doesn't really matter to me, Mr. Kissoon. What matters is very early in the process, I was invited to join the group by Alfred Bulai. Alfred Bulai is a former teacher of mine, somebody I hold in very high regard. And so when he engaged with me post 2020, the 2020 elections, I was primed and ready to get involved. The 2020 elections, as a young person observing that, it impacted me in very many ways. And where I came out of that, I decided that I was going to shift my career towards focusing on democratic governance work. I was going to focus my expertise towards finding a solution to address this whole explosion of issues that had just happened in the elections sphere. And so when Mr. Bulai engaged me on that, without question, I'm like, yes, I'm going to get involved. We need to have a civil society group specifically championing this kind of work. And I think when I got there, they had like about five other members already in place. And so I contributed to really helping to set up the framework for what the organization would come to be and look like, and how it tackles its external engagements.
So you would say it's your experience with the 2020 election that would have made you to naturally gravitate to such a body.
Absolutely.
Where were you in that fateful period in the evolution of Guyana? March the 4th, which today is the anniversary,
it is the
where
anniversary.
the thing really started to unfold with Mr. Mingo, until the final court case that said in July the 30th, this thing is over. Where were you in those 5 months, and what were you observing? What were you doing? Because that, at your age, I don't think you're going to forget that.
Oh no, it's one of those things, unfortunately, in my generation's historical timeline that is going to be branded in our memories, I think, for the rest of our lives. On March 4th, I was then the local program consultant for the International Republican Institute in Guyana. We, IRI had conducted programming in the country. And just before we continue, since we're going to talk about IRI's work, I just want to make it clear that my tenure with the organization ended at the end of January 2024. And so, of course, I'm not speaking on behalf of the organization or representing any interests for the organization. These views that I'm sharing are based on information that I am allowed to speak about openly. It's based on IRI's work that it would have done publicly, and these are my personal opinions. Now, back to March 4th, we were at the time, IRI had come to Guyana prior. They had implemented the USAID LEAD project back in 2013 to 2015.
That was the thing with vote like a boss.
That was
or
where
something?
the controversial Vote Like a Boss campaign, this is a voter education campaign that took place just ahead of the 2015 elections. And there are some political leaders in this country who will lay the blame for the loss of the elections that year squarely at the foot of this voter education campaign. I don't agree because, you know, yes, it may have contributed to young people becoming more informed in determining how to cast their vote, but there were many other conditions present nationally that would have contributed to the outcome of elections those years, in that particular year. So, you know, IRI is here from 2013 to 2015, and coincidentally, it was my emergence as an activist in the political sphere was tied to their work during that time. The then head of the presidential secretariat, the late Dr. Roger Luncheon, he sadly passed away last year. I was very sad about that. Dr. Luncheon and I had a very public debate in the lettuce columns of the Stabroek News during the period that the LEAD project was launched. And at the time, the government of Guyana was saying that the proposed outcomes and actions of this particular program threatened the country's sovereignty. As a young citizen at the time, and I was nobody, and I'm just a little country girl at the University of Guyana, nobody knows who I am, nothing. I disagreed with that. As a young person, I felt like we young people needed an opportunity to learn about political processes, to learn about civic processes, to learn about why it was important for us to participate in elections and how we could contribute to decision making. And I viewed the LEAD project in that vein. I saw it as an opportunity for young people to learn. And so Dr. Luncheon and I would go on to briefly debate, you know, the usefulness of this project in the lettuce column. And I will forever be grateful to Dr. Luncheon for taking my correspondence seriously and deciding that it warranted a response, because what he did was he gave value to my voice. And I really had hoped that you know, I would be able to see him one day again to say, Dr. Luncheon, since our first debate, this is how I've grown as a young Guyanese, as a professional in this space. And I wanted to thank him, and I never managed to get that meeting with him before he passed. But I am very grateful to Dr. Luncheon for that moment in time, because our disagreement and spirited debate on the issue really cemented my decision to continue to work in the area. And so, you know, this project now, elements of it are allowed to be implemented. The 2015 elections happen. IRI then shortly after exits the country. As these international non-governmental organizations, INGOs like IRI tend to do, they'll come back ahead of a particular electoral period or a major democratic event in the country to do what equates to a needs assessment, to see whether the people and leaders of the country do have needs, and whether those needs intersect with two things: the INGO's expertise or technical expertise that it can possibly provide in an assistance effort, and whether the needs and interests of that country also intersect with the interests of the funding bodies, right? And groups like IRI, the National Democratic Institute, the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, groups, those types of groups get their funding primarily through congressional mechanisms. So that they'll get it through US aid, they'll get it through the National Endowment for Democracy, NED, and that's how they determine. So 2019, when IRI came back, they would have done a needs assessment, and their former head of mission, he knew of me as a young person from before. He knew of my activism, and he reached out and he said, well, what are you doing? Would you be interested in getting involved? We may have some vacancies coming up. And so that then led to my engagement with the institution. So what that initial program focused on doing, it was similar to some of the work it had done prior. So voter education was a major component of the work. And so this time they would have conducted, instead of a vote like a boss, it was an Ink It Up campaign. That was the slogan.
Ink It Up.
Ink It Up, yeah. There was a whole jingle, and they were doing the thing, you know, those push carts with the music at the market and so on. You know, the civil society.
But that's the kind of work you were doing while you were
right. So we were doing voter education work, And the way in which IRA was working, we were building the capacity of local civil society organizations, partners, to be able to implement the work. And then IRA was also creating room for those local partners to shape what the work would look like as well. And so we were doing voter education work. We were also working with a civil society group to train local elections observers. And we were providing some degree of technical assistance to the Guyana Elections Commission, and that came in the form of two Jamaican experts. One was an IT expert, and the other one is, I guess, an electoral management expert who is a former head of the electoral management body in Jamaica itself, Art Fisher. So we did provide technical assistance. And so when March 4th now happens, there's also COVID happening around the same time. So there's the breakdown in the electoral process, and then there's also the exit of a lot of the representatives of foreign missions, including from IRA's mission, right? Because COVID now happens and there's an emergency call for them to exit the country. And so my foreign colleagues would have exited the country. This breakdown is happening, COVID hits us, and then we go into a lockdown subsequently. And well, that's where I was and what I was doing.
Okay, but you want to share your thoughts on how you felt the 5 months was shaping the direction the 5 months were going into, because the Commission of Inquiry report is out there now.
Yes.
There were
yes.
There were just too many hair raising things.
Look, from day one when the process broke down, and one of the things that the 2020 electoral process influenced in my career is I decided that I would go on to specialize in electoral policy and administration. I am currently working on wrapping up my master's in electoral policy and administration in the spring semester of next year. So that's around next March, April. So I hope to have that closed off. And
it's coming near to the election.
It's coming, right.
The election is November
exactly.
2025.
I want to make sure I'm wrapping up that prior to the 2025 elections so that I have as much technical expertise as possible to contribute however I can in that upcoming process. Now, I decided to obviously go on to specialize, and you'll have to forgive me, I'm having a bit of a brain fog. I mentioned this to you. Could you repeat the original question so I ensure I'm targeting it well?
Well, no, I just wanted to know how
I felt.
It wasn't normally around the world. Election breakdown at least would take a week
Right.
or a little 14 days. This thing stretched on
5 months.
for
All right,
5
good.
months, and
Yeah.
each week there is something. And the nation looks at it and say, what is going on here?
Yeah, it was the longest Super Bowl, I would say, in Guyana, and not to make light of it, but you know how we are in the Caribbean. We have to laugh at things that hurt us. And so it obviously influenced the direction of my career now at that point. But what it also did was, I'm attending case studies right now for my degree, and I just actually shared what we call the Mingo effect in one of those case study sessions. And my classes are people who work in elections administration across the world, right? And some of them are the Vishnu Prasads or the Claudette Singhs of the world. So I'm mid-level compared to them, and they were shocked. Some of my colleagues said they've never heard of an attempt quite like that one to break down an electoral process. So the one thing we have to give to the elements that were involved in breaking down that process is that they were quite original in how they did it. And we have to be grateful that it was done, because we now know it's possible and we know what needs to be addressed in the system to deal with that. But more on the personal end of things, right? You remember I'm growing up with 2 generations before me with all of these stories about rigged elections throughout Guyana's history, about the protests and even some of my childhood. I remember very clearly the protests down Regent Street, the burning of businesses. One I will never forget. It's former late President Janet Jagan, when they took this puppet of her and burnt it in front of Parliament building. I remember seeing that on the television, right? And so there are these, clear, violent, some of them are memories I have as a child, but some of them are memories being passed on to me by my relatives, by my wider community. But it doesn't quite sink in that this is what it means to have elections in Guyana until we get to March 4th now. And I think that's when my generation fully gets it, because we're at a moment in time where information flows freely. Guyana, last I checked, I think our internet penetration is in the high 80s, like maybe 89% or so. So we have 89% or possibly more by now, people in this country with access to the internet. And so whether those people are reading the news from websites or they're on Facebook or whichever social media platform, they're getting news coming to them live and direct. So they now have information to make up their mind on what they think is happening in the country. And so there's no barrier to accessing the information. The only thing you have to be careful with is the source of the information, who is saying what, and you have to be careful to filter it. But I think the one thing that I realized immediately, something was wrong. Something was wrong. And it didn't matter what your political views were and which party you voted for or didn't vote for, or maybe you don't like none of the political options available to you on the ballot, so you voted for nobody. But as a citizen of this country, looking at that and realizing that something is wrong, as a citizen, you have a duty to speak up and speak out against it. Right? This is an attack on the very fabric of your nation. And we talk about nationhood, but people don't seem to realize that when we talk about nationhood, we're talking about our lives, right? Our individual lives is what we're talking about. When we talk about politics, what we're talking about is every single thing that happens to you from the moment you wake up and walk out your door. Let's say I walk out my door and, we had a lot of rainfall and there's a pothole right in front of my gate, and I walk out there, I'm a foot fall in the pothole, God forbid, and I sprain my ankle, right? I can connect that straight back to the responsibilities of local government officials and the bodies responsible for it. I can also target back right back to my responsibility as a citizen for electing those officials, right? And I don't think that at that moment when this is happening, people quite realize that this is not some mystical thing that's happening removed from their reality. This is happening in their reality, and it's going to have repercussions not just for the life that they're living every day at that moment, but for the life that they would live a few years after, and that their children and grandchildren and offspring would live after. And so for me, it actually befuddled me that people were saying that nothing was wrong. Something was wrong.
Akash?
Sarah, I want to ask you, what are your views on race relations in Guyana and what has to be done? We have problems.
Yes.
What are your views and what has to be done?
Well, you read my blog, I think you'll get a good canvassing of my views on
So you've been posting lately?
I haven't posted lately, but I think all of the historical pieces are there.
But this country dynamism allows changes to relentlessly go on.
The bottom line is, I can't tell you what the solution is. We've tried a few different solutions, right? We've had lots of social cohesion programs, either being championed by different government departments and or ministries. We've had lots of international development resources being channeled to address it. Giants in civil society with decades of experience, people, let me don't call names because I can't call all of them, but there are many people who have also tried to bring about some sort of reconciliation process. They've tried to work on national unity, social cohesion. It's clear that it's something that we struggle with. How we address that, it's not necessarily that the solutions we've tried in the past aren't the right solutions. It could be that the timing was off, right? Timing is everything. Maybe the moments in which we've attempted to address it just were not the right moment. Now, something that I believe people miss when we have the entire conversation about race, it's what is it driven by? And when you look at political culture in the Caribbean, when you look at our governance structures and so forth, most of us in this region are former colonies, right? And so the influence for our political system and culture comes from a particular place. Now, independence for Guyana and for other nations didn't necessarily mean that the colonial powers were immediately absent or that there was no continued efforts by external forces to influence the politics of this country. And I know we could talk at this table for days about that, right? But we won't. I'm just canvassing it very briefly to make the point. External influences are also there, driving whatever conflict is beneficial to the outcome that suits people's agendas and interests. And in the area of race, unfortunately, it has primarily been a tool for winning elections, for influencing views, and lots of things in the fabric of our nation's history will tell you why it is a tool and why it's been a successful tool. But what drives the conflict? What has been driving the conflict across generation is the competition for resources. So whether we're talking about land, whether we're talking about gold, bauxite, now oil is the latest resource in the center of this conflict. We're talking about a very plural society, a society with many different people from many different backgrounds who've only been here for what? How long we've been here, Mr. Kissoon? 6, 7 generations together? About?
Yeah.
Right? So we're children of immigrants and we've been here for 6, 7 generations together, and we come from so many different worldviews and culture. There are challenges with making that work. And what it boils down to is this competition over resources. And now the people with the most power in this competition are the people with the larger population sizes, right? And the two ethnic groups with the largest population in this country have long-standingly been Guyanese of African ancestry and Guyanese of Indian ancestry. And so I like to term that black and brown politics.
But let me, as time is going, let me ask you this. One of the things in these discussions, all the time, whether it's symposia, whether it's interviews, whether it's academic output, there's always this thing about race relation. And one of the things that misses us is that a predominantly Indian party, a predominantly African party, has to get 51% of the votes to win a majority. The Indians are 39. Let's say 40.
Right.
The Africans are 29, let's say 30. So that is 60 for the Indian party, although I don't think, better safe to say predominantly. So if you have a predominantly Indian party at 40%, they need 11% of course racial voting to win. The same thing with the other predominantly African party. And I think that has opened up a whole new ball game where you have to reach out.
No, absolutely. And look, I've said this a couple times this week already. I have to keep reminding people, what are political parties in the business of doing? Winning elections, correct? Political parties are in the business of winning elections to a certain power to control resources and to represent interests, hopefully. But primarily, a political party is set up to win votes, to win an election, to then govern a space and to control the resources in that space. And that is what they do. Now, how they do it depends on the sociocultural landscape that they have available to them. And in Guyana's case, what has largely influenced voting behavior and patterns in this country is ethnic-based loyalty, right? That has impacted voter behavior. Now, I agree with you. Yes, we have seen some shifts happening and opening up of the space. It's obvious that there are, swing voters. It's also obvious that the parties are not purely supported by one ethnicity. The majority of their constituents may come from either the black or brown side, but they do have cross voters. So clearly, you know, the People's Progressive Party has quite a diverse looking cabinet right now. And even if you look across the House to the opposition side of the House, there's also some diversity there as well. So clearly we're not talking purely black and brown voting, not at all. Now, to what degree we've had either mixed demographics or we've had a cross ethnic voting happening, I would be hard pressed to say because we don't have the data coming to us. I would love for GCOM to put out a report on the elections one year that gives us that kind of number, right? Whether it is we need to conduct some sort of survey at the polling stations, but tell us, yeah, voter turnout, we know what voter turnout is, but tell us what the breakdown of that voter turnout was. You know, how many women, how many men, what was their ethnic demographic age group, and that sort of data. And I think if we could have that, we may be able to have a richer discussion on your point that there is some crossover. Now, what the 2015 elections taught me is that at least there's a tiny percentage of swing voters. It has to be larger than what it is, right? So I think at that time it was 0.01% of the final. So we're like a minority within a minority. But there are those swing voters in existence, and we're the people who are going to vote based on issues for whichever political party.
Okay, so our operator signal our time has come. Gus?
Oh no.
Yeah, you were with the International Republican Institute since 2019. They're gone. Briefly, are they coming back? And do you see the shaping of crisis-free election, just briefly? Because based on your experience, you're out there with the International Republican Institute.
So I don't know if IRI will come back, but I should point out that because of recent shifts in U.S. foreign policy interests under the Biden administration, as well as the shift in global priorities, you know, what's happening in Ukraine, Israel, Palestine, and Sudan, and there are a few other key global things ongoing, it's really shifted international development resources to those more sensitive global priorities. So unfortunately for Guyana and several other Latin American and the Caribbean spaces, we've seen the exit of not just IRI, but NDI and IFES as well from programming in certain areas. The 2025 elections, because of its significance in the geopolitical space, I do expect to see support coming back, whether it comes through the traditional INGOs we've seen or through the diplomatic missions. I would be hard pressed to say which or what combination, but I believe we are going to see the presence, particularly in the realm of international observers. Do I see a peaceful elections? You know, honestly, I don't know. I know people said that the last local elections were supposed to be a measure of how successful the reforms and so on would be, but I do not personally believe that we've sufficiently addressed the changes that needed to occur prior to having a next major general elections in this country.
We still have 2 years to get there. Sarah,
yes. Our
operator signal, we got to go. On behalf of my co-host Akash Prasad, Akash and I have to come and have some sushi.
Absolutely.
At your place at the Seawall. I'm always there. I saw you there last week.
Thanks for having me.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for watching us. Our guest was Sara Bharrat, former journalist, former civil society activist, and just demitted office as program manager for the International Republican Institute. And her area of expertise, which she's working on, is democratic governance. Thanks for being with us on behalf of Sara Bharrat and Akash Prasad. Catch you later. Bye-bye.